Thanks, everybody. Hi, I'm Wendy Nather. I am with Duo Security, which is now part of Cisco. And I'm here to talk about what CISOs wish they could say out loud. So everybody in the audience, raise your hand if you're a CISO, if you've been waiting for me to say things that lie heavy upon your heart. Yeah, represent. I'm going to let them out for you. What you're going to get from this presentation is, first of all, if you're not a CISO, you'll get an understanding of how things work behind the scenes when you are a CISO. You'll get the ability in some cases to read between the lines of public announcements. And if you are a CISO, you will get the knowledge that you are not alone. Please do not feel alone, especially in these challenging times. So why is everything so secret? Why can't CISOs just stand up and say things? Well, first of all, they are in a terrible situation in that if you get up on a stage as a CISO and say, oh, things are really bad, we're having problems with this and that, it's going to be a license for everybody to go, pull, and then they're just going to target you. And if you get up on the stage and say, things are great, we've got something that's working really well for us, same thing. They're going to go pull, and they're going to target you. So there's not a whole lot that you can actually say on a stage. So basically, loose lips sink ships, because security, anytime you're running a program, it's never going to be perfect. And the risks to admitting it are substantial. And I can't blame CISOs. They're like, why should we take one for the team? Why should I get up there and be the only one to talk about what the problems are? So I feel as though in my current position as the head of the advisory CISO team at Duo, that part of what we can do to help is say those things that really need to be said but are too risky for current CISOs to be able to say. Now, one thing that everybody should understand is when you don't know why something is so bad or appears so insecure, what you don't realize is there's always a series of threads leading back to what was probably a good reason at the time. So I love this tweet that I collected quite a while ago. When was that? That was in 16, yeah. The answer to what idiot did this is almost always a very smart, well-intentioned person making trade-offs you hadn't even considered. So for example, when I was a CISO, I had to do some remediation of a single sign-on portal. And when we looked into the code, we discovered that in the credential string that was being sent to the application, for each application that this portal serviced, each credential string had the name of the project manager in it. And you would go, why? Why would somebody do something like that? Well, the only thing that I could figure out is that probably at the time, it was very difficult to figure out which project manager was responsible for each particular application. And if you were troubleshooting something and you were looking at the credential string, immediately you knew whom to call. So somebody thought that was a good idea, and somebody put it in there. So there are things like that all the time. There are good reasons for something. Maybe they're not good reasons anymore, but at the time, they were a good or at least a very plausible reason. Another example, if you're designing multi-factor authentication, you have to design it for people who don't have cell phones at all, people who have flip phones, so not smartphones, people who share phones, which they do in a lot of the world. Poorer families maybe have one phone to share. People who share login accounts, and yes, it happens all the time, and you get really good at discovering it once you implement two-factor authentication. People who are on planes, for example, people who only have Wi-Fi that can't get a cellular signal, and people who panic easily. You might wonder where this comes from. If you're using a hardware token where you're using time-based OTP and you have to type in a code before it times out, if you try to get certain people to type in that number and read it and copy it over into the screen before it flips over, people who tend to panic are not very good at using that kind of token. So you have to take a lot of bizarre factors into account when you're trying to design a security solution. And also, it comes down to the support burden, because nobody wants to deal with calling up support for help, even if they're super nice people, because it interrupts your flow. It costs the user time and focus to get help. They don't want to do it. They get annoyed. Even if it's something that wasn't their fault, even if they're going to have a great person on the phone, it still is something that they don't like. And also, it costs your organization every time you have to field a call. So another example, when I was a CISO, I had pen testers looking at an application, and they came back with a finding that said, oh, you're sending an error message whenever somebody gets an invalid username. You can't do that. That's really insecure. That's really bad. That helps an attacker enumerate usernames. And we were like, yes, we know, but it's a much bigger risk and a much higher cost to have our community of users who maybe log in once a year and cannot for the life of them remember their login name, to be able to figure it out without having to call us. I'm sorry, but this is not as big of a security issue as it is a support issue, so we're not going to fix this. So you're going to have discussions with this all the time with CISOs when it comes down to support. Here's a question everybody complains about. You always see this on Twitter where somebody's saying, oh, I can't use 20 characters in my password, or why can't I use this special password? These people are so stupid. You know why? Most of the time, it's a legacy system. Way on the back end, especially in banks where they still have mainframes, you've got a legacy system that cannot handle a more advanced password. But the mainframe has been around for 30 or 40 years, and you know what? It is not going away. Because have you ever tried to migrate off a mainframe? I have. When I started one position as a CISO, they said, yeah, we're in the middle of a mainframe migration over to Unix, and here's some of the information on where we are, and you're going to have to help. 5 years later, they were still trying to migrate off of that mainframe. I don't know if they ever made it. So you know what? There are things that you are stuck with. Stop making fun of people who are trying to do the best that they can with what they have. Because I'm going to tell you right now, the older a system is, the more inertia it has. So if it's really old, if it's ancient, if it's NT boxes, and yes, those are still around too, if it's still in use, it's generally business critical. And the more critical it is, the more it costs to migrate off of it. Duh. It's probably full of duct tape and wire and dependencies and all sorts of things that have been fixed temporarily in production, and it would just be too costly to fix it on the back end, so they're just going to keep patching that thing in production. And as we are realizing now, legacy systems often outlast the people who maintain them. Everybody's seen the call out for COBOL programmers? Yep, they are still needed because those systems were built to last. They are durable. They are still doing the job that they need to be doing, but the people who program them have either moved on from that organization or they've moved on, if you know what I mean. So, this is getting more and more difficult with these legacy systems. Give these folks a break. Like I said, they're doing the best they can with what they're stuck with. The next question, and this is a favorite one from researchers: why does it take so long to fix a vulnerability? I have a whole talk about this, explaining all the things that can go wrong, but I'm not going to do all of it here. Here's the TLDR. Let's start with business fundamentals, all right? First of all, most CIOs don't have spare people around just sitting around waiting to fix things. They have all of their people, all of their resources very tightly scheduled throughout the development chain, and usually those people are overworked as it is. They are trying to do more than they possibly can in a day's work anyway. So they don't have spare people who can go and fix things. And some schedules for things that they have to deliver are not changeable. For example, legislative mandates. If a legislature says you have got to deliver this application by this date, you cannot stop to fix things. If it's going to take extra time, you've got to get it out and hope that you can fix it later. That's just reality. That's just business fundamentals. Also, remediation is more than a code change. So when you're doing vulnerability testing, you know, you've got to run and validate those scans. I remember poor Matt Tesaro, who used to work for me as an application security person, delivering him 500-page PDFs and him just looking at me with the saddest face you can imagine, having to go through and validate all of these scans and their findings. Then you have to prioritize the fixes based on multiple factors. Sometimes you can't start with something that is the most critical vulnerability as rated by your application security vendor or your tool. You have to look at, well, which one can we get the original developers back for? Who's free right now? What's going to take the least time to fix? What's going to be the least disruptive to production? What is either going to give us the biggest bang if we fix it among multiple applications at one time, or if you're thinking of what's the least disruptive, what has the fewest dependencies to work on. So you may go through a whole chart of factors to figure out what you should be fixing first and prioritizing, either by cost, by schedule, by, you know, what's the right time, the right phase of the moon. You know, this application is, you know, we've got an options expiration date coming up, so we cannot change this trading application until after that time. All sorts of things on the calendar. So it's kind of like a game of mousetrap, if you've ever seen that game. I've got a picture of it right here, where you have to line everything up just right and get everything in order so the ball rolls down and it flips this and it changes that and it sets us free, and then the guy plunges into the swimming pool and it brings down the mousetrap. You have to line all of this up to do a remediation. It is very, very complicated, even if you don't count the communications out to your customers and or to the press, to the public, scheduling things. So another example of how complicated this can be is that I used to work with a change control board that had a rule that if you made any changes to the code, you needed to create a traceability matrix. You needed to have a written requirement for why it needed to be changed, and you needed to be able to trace it all the way to the lines of code that were being changed. And that sounds fair, right? You know, if you want to have discipline in change control in an organization, you got to have documentation and trace everything to why did we change this? Well, because of this requirement. But if you go back to that 500-page PDF from a Fortify scan, and you're looking at each of those findings, and you're trying to trace them back to all the lines of code you're going to change in a huge application, suddenly that's not as practical anymore, is it? So you can have a lot of arguments with your change control board or with other departments for something that seems like a good reason at the time, but when you're actually trying to do security fixes, it's not so straightforward anymore. So remediation is a whole lot more than a code change. It's more than the code fixes. It's getting the code to build on site. I had an application that we had to remediate where we didn't even have a copy of that code in development anymore. We had to read it off of a backup, stand up a temporary server to load it on, and then try to get it to build there. And I remember the developer only had a part of his time to work on this, and he could not get it to build on this server. And I kept saying, look, you know, I've got some consultants. Do you want them to help you? And he'd be like, no, I'm fine. 2 months went by, and he finally let somebody else help him with it. And they got it to build. They figured out that he had run some kind of script, I don't remember what it was, to do a code cleanup. And he changed spaces to tabs, or he did something else to clean up the code to where it broke it. So after we figured that out, we finally got the code to build so that we could start fixing it. Identifying surprise dependencies. You just never know what's going to be broken. Another example, we were trying to secure some logins, and we decided it would be a great idea to encrypt the password that was included in the credential string. Don't ask me why that was required, but we found out that encrypting the password in the credential string broke the receiving application. Now, why that application needed to read the password again, I don't know. I don't know if we ever found out, but it's one of these things where you think, oh my God, now we have to go back and fix all the other applications. And this, again, is going to change your remediation schedule. Scheduling the fixes and scheduling QA time, because again, your QA people are probably incredibly busy. So even if they don't have to build any new tests, you're still going to have to try to get on their schedule when you're done at the right time. So all of this adds up to a huge amount of time. Even if making the fixes don't take that long in and of themselves, in the talk that I give where I talk about one particular application, I had consultants who were fixing the code and they did it and turned it around within 6 weeks. They were great. They were perfect. But us getting to deploy it to production took a year for all of the reasons that I just explained to you. So yes, these things are not as fast as you think they ought to be, and they may have very little to do with the actual act of fixing the code. Moreover, when you are a CISO, you are dealing with two different views of probability and risk. So yes, you can talk with your management about the impact if something were to happen. You know, if somebody were to exploit this vulnerability, the impact would be this. And they'd say, sure, but we don't agree with your probability. We don't think it's actually going to happen. And so even if you agree that if worst comes to worst, you would lose $11 billion in federal funding, they're going to say, you know, I really don't think this is going to happen, and we are not going to pay all the support costs that could outweigh the theoretical breach cost because we don't believe in that probability. This is kind of what I call cheeseburger risk management. This is where, you know, you decide you're going to eat cheeseburgers until your first heart attack and then you're going to stop. This happens all the time in security, and CISOs have to deal with it. I heard a story about one CIO who was being briefed on a real attack that was happening to peers that was likely to come to his organization next. And he actually said, let's just wait until they actually attack us. So let's wait for the probability to equal 1.0, and then we will do something about it. Now, you might be clutching your pearls right now and saying, oh my God, how can they do this? But think about this from a business perspective. If it costs you, say, $1 million a year to run a security program, and you didn't get breached until the next year, the second year, and it only cost you $500,000 to remediate and clean up, you came out ahead from a business perspective. $2 million versus $500,000. That's a business decision. Business people are making these decisions all the time, and this is the sort of thing that CISOs have to live with. And if you understand the business imperative, you can't really argue it with them because you can't tell them, oh yes, this is absolutely going to happen. The most you can say is, I think the probability is X, and they say, great, we think the probability is Y. So this is where the poor CISO is stuck. This is a quote from another friend of mine who is a CISO. And they said, sometimes we have to wait for a breach to get justification for what we already know needs to be done. When we're lucky, it's somebody else's breach. So I know of somebody else who managed to get permission to encrypt their point-of-sale terminals. And it took seeing breaches from other competitive retailers. And once they saw that the competition was getting breached, they got permission in about 2 or 3 days to roll out that encryption, but it cost them the price of rolling 27,000 trucks out, 27,000 truck rolls out to those locations, 27,000 retail stores to do that encryption change for their point of sale systems. That is a lot of logistics and a lot of costs. But when their management saw the probability get high enough to where they actually believed it was going to happen, then they were willing to spend the money. And that's what business is all about, waiting for the right time to spend the money. Not doing it too soon, doing it just in time, which obviously doesn't always work. But here we are. Now, another thing that CISOs really want to say to people out there who are reporting vulnerabilities is, who asked you? Really? There's this whole thing about the relationship between organizations and vulnerability researchers, and we could go on for days about that. In fact, I'm sure we will here at GRIMMCon. But the fact of the matter is, just because you have volunteered yourself to do some vulnerability testing for them, doesn't mean they appreciate it, doesn't mean you're needed. Maybe they already knew about this and they're not going to say anything because they're still in the middle of fixing it. They don't actually necessarily owe you an explanation or thanks. And this is one of these things that CISOs really would like to say, but they can't, because that will just make everybody angry at them and make them, target them more. But that's why I'm going to say it here. Who asked you? So, for example, remember the guy who claimed to have hacked a plane and made it fly sideways in flight? Well, strictly speaking, all planes do fly a little bit sideways, tacking into the wind sort of thing. But can you change the software mid-flight? I remember at the time, airline CISO saying to me, no, you can't do it. But they weren't allowed to say anything. What's really cool, though, is that one of them, who was a CISO at the time at American Airlines, finally got permission to give a talk. And if you look at, if you pick up this link later on, Dan Glass, if you Google for his talk, The Road to DevSecOps, he says a lot of great things that, frankly, I can't believe that American Airlines let him say, but it gives you a great view into what it's really like to be a CISO at an airline. So I highly recommend this talk. It's one of the few chances you will get to hear from the CISO of generally a very closed-mouthed industry, because this is about physical safety. It's not just about security. So in a nutshell, if you're appalled at the state of security in a lot of organizations, it just means you haven't been paying attention, because CISOs know how bad things are. They're not allowed to say anything. I've had lots of CISOs come up to me after a talk like this and go, yes, that's us, don't tell anybody. So there's just a whole lot more going on behind the scenes. And CISOs will say, yes, we know about this problem. It's very hard to fix. We're trying, okay? Best we can do. The other thing that especially vendors don't understand is that usually their products are designed to work assuming that every organization has the same Olympic-sized swimming pool that they're going to be implementing this in. But the problem is, when it comes to real-life security in a real environment, nobody has that standard Olympic-sized swimming pool. It's more like the open ocean. And everybody's in different parts of the open ocean. Some are in the Caribbean, where things are a little bit easier. Some are in the middle of the Pacific, in the middle of those huge, trash islands or whatever that are forming there. All of the environments are very, very different. And I'm here to tell you that every organization has a security kraken that they know about. It's a huge security problem in their organization that everybody knows about, but they can't talk about, or they can only talk about in whispers like, yes, we know this thing is really bad. We have been trying to fix it for 5 years. Everybody's got a security kraken. So if you get the trust of a CISO, maybe one day they will tell you about that security kraken if you don't discover it by yourself. But the thing is that these things are known, they're just not talked about. Here's another example, another great quote that somebody passed on to me. When Heartbleed came out, they asked somebody, aren't you worried about Heartbleed? And they said, no, because we don't use encryption. No, really, that really happened. They really said that. So yes, it is bad out there. Another quote from a CISO friend of mine, he says that he spends a lot of time as head of security apologizing to upper management about the poor state of InfoSec vendors. This is, I want to be clear that, you know, whenever you're poking a hole in the security for an organization, I can promise you that InfoSec vendors also have their own security krakens. They also have their own security problems. If they're really good vendors, they spend a lot of time searching them out and working on them. But in a lot of cases, security vendors talk a completely different way to organizations than they do inside. You know, they will lecture a CISO about what they should be doing, what the threats are. Let me tell you something. One thing you should never say to a CISO is, let me tell you about the threats. You know, they already know what the threats are. There's nothing more irritating as a CISO to have a vendor come in and tell me what my job is, okay? I'm just like, dude, you try to do this. You come sit in my seat and you try to do this job. So if you are not communicating well as a security vendor with your customers, they're going to be spending time going back to the management saying, yes, I know they were jerks. I'm sorry, but we really need the tool, okay? So bear that in mind. If you want to read between the lines of what CISOs say or what they say publicly, we have the famous line, we take our customer security seriously. You know, 10, 15 years ago when I was a CISO, I thought I came up with that line myself. I didn't realize just how cliched it was going to be because I thought it was a good thing to say. This is why everybody says it. It's a good thing to say. You can't not say it, but yes, we're just trying to say, look, we're not blowing you off. We are taking this seriously. If you have to say publicly because your attorney said so that we have no evidence that this thing occurred, the translation is often, well, you know, you can't prove a negative, which is true. You can't. We looked all over. We can't find any evidence that this happened, so this is the best we can do. If they say it was a sophisticated attack, well, sophisticated for us at any rate, yep. Or it was a state-sponsored attack because that's what our DFIR vendor told us it was. All right, you know, that's good. That's the best we can do. But seriously, you know, let's be realistic. Nobody is going to admit to something in public that's going to make them look bad unless they are very, very good at PR jujitsu. Now, I've seen companies that have been, you know, breached, that have been, have had vulnerabilities disclosed that they weren't ready to fix or that they're in the middle of fixing. And if they handle it very, very well, they come out of it looking even better. I'm sure you can think of an example of an organization that said, yeah, you know, they owned up to it. They're doing the right thing by their customers. We trust them. You know, it was bad that it happened, but it happens to a lot of people. Find out who their PR people are and try to hire them for yourself, because that is a really, really high-level skill to be able to turn something like that into a PR bonus. Now, then again, it could be that their breach is so public that denying it would be even worse. And that's true. That's really not where you want to be. But the other thing is that gag orders come in many, many shapes and sizes. If you know of an organization that has a public breach, everybody knows it, and they still can't say anything, chances are they're like this close to having the FBI, you know, capture the attributed actor, or there's something else that they are frantically trying to fix because it would be even worse if that got out just yet. They may be under some sort of NDA. There are lots of reasons why they maybe can't say what you think they ought to be saying in public. But again, in a lot of cases, they probably have really good reasons for it. Don't start out by attributing evil to an organization. Again, they're doing the best they can with what they have, and there are a lot of things going on behind the scenes that you don't know about. It's not your business to know about it. They're not going to tell you about it. If you're lucky, you might hear it over beers years later. And yes, I hear a lot of those stories. Those are pretty cool. So what can we do? Let's try to turn this into a positive. I've talked about how hard things are. What can we really do? First of all, information sharing would be great. If you are in an organization where you're in a position to join an ISAC or another intel sharing group, I really encourage you to do so. Now, I know it's difficult to get permission to do this. A lot of information sharing goes on over the aforementioned beers in private, where, you know, don't tell anybody I told you this, but we're seeing this. And, you know, when I worked at the retail ISAC, I used to get those people together so they could share those stories very quietly all the time. But here's the thing, the more you can share, the better, because if only outliers share information, then the only data that anybody gets are outliers. So you might only get information on, you know, threat intel or information on security from, let's say, you know, the really high level organizations that have figured this out and are okay with sharing data, like, you know, the Targets of the world, or, you know, MGM Resorts, or, you know, the, I'm thinking of some of the other organizations who are founding members and on the board of the retail ISAC. You know, if you only get data from those very sophisticated organizations where they have, you know, 60 or 100 security people, you're going to get great stuff, but it may not be applicable to you if you only have a team of 5 or you are a team of 1. So the more you contribute from your perspective and the more different perspectives we get in sharing this information, the better it's going to be for everybody. Because nobody wants to go to a big conference and only hear from the banks, because the banks are the only ones who give their speakers permission to talk about things. We want to hear many different stories, because the more we learn, the more we're going to be able to apply to what we're doing. So please try to speak up more. Work with groups like the US NTIA. I'm going to give a shout out here to folks like Alan Friedman, who are leading groups in the Department of Commerce to try to work with multiple stakeholders to solve big problems. Like, for example, they have a multi-stakeholder vulnerability disclosure process that they have been working on for several years. You can look at one of the reports that came out of this process, and it, you know, represented the perspective of researchers as well as vendors and other organizations. Here you can see that they found that 60% of the researchers were afraid that they might be subjected to legal proceedings if they disclosed their work, and only 15% of them expected compensation. That's a really important note to share, because a lot of organizations, if you come to them with a vulnerability and you phrase it wrong, they're going to think that you're trying to extort them. There's a very thin line between, hey, you know, I found this vulnerability, do you have a bug bounty program? And hey, I found this vulnerability, and if you pay me this amount of money, I'll tell you what it is. Yeah, don't do that. But 53% of those researchers who, you know, participated in this process survey expected at least acknowledgement, you know, maybe a t-shirt. 70% expected regular communication. Having this discussion is really, really important, because if you scare an organization, they will lash out with lawyers. Because if you don't know how to handle a vulnerability report, if somebody comes to you and says something is broken, you're going to treat it as a threat. On the other side, if you don't have empathy as a researcher for an organization, you will be treated as a threat. But if it's not a fight, nobody has to bring PR and legal into it. So that's why these groups are so important. Always wait to escalate in disclosure. I think this is a really good I mean, this isn't just for vulnerability disclosure. This is any place where you're not feeling understood and you're trying very hard to do the right thing, you're trying to get something done, try to wait to escalate. And especially, try to go beyond the surveys that you see out there about what's going on in security. Surveys tend to measure the biases of the researchers. I've seen a lot of surveys that were actually marketing research instead of security research. Like they tried to ask and find out things that the marketing department of that organization wanted to know, or that the product team wanted to know. It was not something that the public necessarily wanted to know. So benchmarking surveys don't always tell you the right state of security. Metrics also tie you down. If you only try to fix the things that you can measure, yes, I know the old saying about, you can't improve what you can't measure. I don't believe that at all. Metrics tie you down. If you wait until you can figure out how to measure something, you may be slow to improve it. So don't throw those metrics away, but don't use them as a substitute for real discussion on how to fix a process or how to improve communication between people. Because sometimes that's the problem. It is not necessarily how many bug reports you got in or what the criticality was or how many CVEs or whatever. The important thing that we all want to know is what really works in security. And CISOs are trying to figure this out just as much as everybody else is. How do we know this is working? What really works? We still have a lot of research to do. So let's wrap up and think of things to try at home if you're a CISO. If you try reading those NTIA multi-stakeholder vulnerability disclosure guidelines, and if you want to see the work continue on that, they still have a lot to do to spread it in the community. Try contacting Alan Friedman on Twitter. He's a wonderful guy. Have a plan for what to do if Brian Krebs calls, because as we know, Brian Krebs is the intrusion detection for a lot of organizations. Seriously, have a plan for what to do if some researcher or journalist like Brian Krebs calls you and says, is it true? Because I'm seeing something weird on your site, or I'm, seeing this on the dark web. Is this your data? Don't panic and hang up on him. Say to the researcher, thank you. We really appreciate this. We're going to go investigate this and we'll call you right back. Get permission to contribute something to the community that you do well. Please try to get out there so that we can see that there are things going well in security. And ask your management which benchmarks they're going to believe. Which probabilities will they believe? Because as I talked about before, probability is all about belief. If you're a researcher, make friends at companies before you start notifications. Have a good Rolodex. The more they trust you, the more they're going to accept what you bring to them. Also, try reading these guidelines and add your opinions. Find the people who run the bug bounties and learn from their experiences, and find a CISO and buy them a drink. Really, they need that drink. They really need that drink. If you're a vendor, learn about the customer environments in which you're operating and review your marketing materials and reports. And zero in on the data that you want the customer to decide on. Please trim everything else out. We don't need to know what the threats du jour are. We already know what those are. And finally, talk to me. As I mentioned, I'm not on Discord. I'm sorry, I'm lame. But you can @ me at Twitter, and you can talk to Bryson right now on Discord, and he will pass over some questions to me. Over to you, Bryson.
Thank you, Wendy. We only have a minute for one really quick answer to one really quick question.
Good. I burned it up.
You burned it up. Well done. You went right through the Q&A. So the question is, the way it's phrased, is it important for a CISO to understand anything about IT? And I think the question there is challenging. How technical should a CISO be?
5. The answer to that is 5. No. that's really hard to say. How technical should a CISO be? Because they come from a lot of different areas. I have known people who are not very technical. I mean, I started in liberal arts in college, and I never did get my degree, but I went on to become a sysadmin. So you tell me, is that technical or is it not? It really depends on how good of a social engineer they are. Because seriously, being a CISO is one of the hardest social engineering problems that there are. You have to get a whole organization to change what it's doing and change it permanently. So that's a lot harder than just trying to get 1,000 people to click on a link. So I've seen some really good non-technical CISOs who were expert social engineers or very, very good business people. As long as they listen to the technical experts and they don't think that they're the only one that has an answer, I think they'll be fine.
Well, Wendy, great to see you again. Again, love the hat. The best in pandemic fashion that I've
Love
seen.
your horn.
And look forward to getting to see you again at some point in the next 2 years when there's a real physical conference again.
Yes, awesome. Take care, everybody. See you around.